Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you all.
It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here at this astounding convening and always to share the stage with you, Glenn.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to Sarah and Sherrilyn for inviting us. Honored to be here. And I brought notes because I'm going to be like a deer in the headlights of Huey's brilliance. So I'm going to forget things, so I brought some notes to answer the brilliant questions you have posed.
All right.
And will pose to me.
Fantastic.
This is a long dialogue that we've been having, so honored to be on the stage with you.
Wonderful. So I thought, Glenn, for this gathering really devoted to thinking critically about the relation between vision and justice, art and belonging, democracy, community, I thought we might start our conversation off with one of your most seminal works, Untitled I'm a Man, of 1988. And in this painting, you cite and reconfigure the posters famously held up by Memphis sanitation workers in 1968 who were seeking fair wages and safe working conditions. And in doing so, these men and women provided a really powerful example of collective mobilization that successfully secured basic rights from the city. So I wonder, Glenn, if you could talk about the circumstances in 1988 that spurred your return to this sign, and how you thought about the relationship between those two very moments, 68 and 88, in the political career of Black masculinity's appearance.
Right. Well, one of the things I thought was interesting as an exercise was to think about who was president at the various moments where I was making the work that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. I realized that Reagan was president around this. So I think it was a time of sort of thinking about the legacy of the civil rights movement, thinking about, and I think part of my work is interested in these sort of ruptures or continuities and ruptures between different historical moments. So thinking about 68 as this moment of, these men carrying these signs, and thinking about 88 and then kind of like 20 years on, what does it mean? What does a sign like this mean? How do we think about our histories? What do we think about the unfinished business of the civil rights movement? But there's a more personal story behind this image, which is that I did a kind of, I think it was a class trip almost, to see Charles Rangel's office in Harlem. And he had one of the posters, was carried in the march, framed in his office. And because I went to a liberal private school in Manhattan, I didn't know anything about it. What's that?
And this was like 81?
Something like that. Yeah. No, earlier than that. But I was sort of fascinated by the image, and then, over time did some research, found out what it was, and it just stuck in my head. So when I started moving from the kind of abstract expressionist work that I was making at the time and more towards text-based work, I kept thinking about these signs and wanted to make a painting. So in some ways it was like the first, in some ways the first mature text painting I made, because it set up a lot of things that were in my practice. The use of a found text, in this case the sign, reference to particular, political movement or historical moment, black and white, because so much of my work started out as being black and white. So it set up a lot of things in my practice. But it is interesting to think about why at that moment, why 88? And I think it must have had some unconscious response to the Reagan and the kind of reevaluation that we were going through. In terms of cycles of, like forward progress and then backwards progress. So I made this painting using oil and enamel paint, and those things don't mix. And so it was kind of falling apart from the beginning, cracking, fissuring. And over time I sort of think, I'm not very good at thinking about metaphor, but over time I can think, well, it's kind of a metaphor about historical process, how our ideas from one generation to another change, mutate, fissure, turn into something else, a kind of sign of the history of the painting itself, but also the history of the ideas behind it. Did it make sense in 1988 to carry a sign that said, "I am a man"? That was one of the questions I was asking myself.
Yeah, no, and I think the urgency and the resonance of that question, always turns us back to that moment and helps us reevaluate where we are. And it's interesting that you talked about the presidential being important, that you're thinking these moments, who is president now? What are the conditions and the vision that's being offered to us? And I just wanted to show this photograph where we have our vice president.
And we almost have it all.
Here, engaging the work,
Yeah.
which now lives in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery of Art. And so I was hoping you could talk about the desires for justice, democracy, shared futures that prompted you to gift this painting to the National Gallery.
Well, I think, Washington is, the sort of symbolic heart of our nation. It is where the March on Washington was. It is where the Klan marched in the 20s. It is where the Million Man March, which we will talk about later, happened. So it's just thinking about National Gallery as the sort of the nation's collection. And this is a painting, the I'm a Man painting was a painting I thought I was going to keep, But when I was approached by the curators there, I thought, well, what better place, practically, symbolically, for this painting to be than the national collection, because it spoke to so much about, our nation's history, the centrality of the Black experience in our nation's history, the centrality of Black artists in the story of art. And so it made sense there. And what has been gratifying over the years is to realize that this painting is on constant rotation. Many curators work at this institution, and many curators request this painting for various kinds of shows. So it is out a lot. And that was important to me, that rather than it goes into collection, they put it up once, and then you don't see it for 10 years. It was important that it could have this life. And this picture here was at the opening of a show called Afro-Atlantic Histories in 2022, which the vice president attended and gave a keynote speech at the opening of that show. And this was in the context of a show that started in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and was looking at the sort of Atlantic slave trade, but from different points of view, from Brazilian history and African American history and art, and looking at the sort of shared themes that were being explored in the art made around the history of the slave trade. And it's importantly that show came from Brazil to Washington, D.C. So this was the occasion for the vice president to see it.
Yeah, and I mean, I've noticed too that as it's moved in different configurations, these incredible synergies are created with different work. So I remember seeing it near an Edmondson sculpture, and it totally brought a different set of questions to mind about your painting, thinking about Edmondson, that emphasis on a certain kind of frontality, but that's filled with depth. And then of course, I've had the opportunity to see the painting once it's off the wall, and to see that there's a greater multivalence of color than one would think, and then they X-rayed it to see if there was even more color under that. So it's been fascinating to see that because it's there, it's not only taking on these different lives in relationship to different works, but also they're increasing the knowledge about the painting and its history.
And there's been a theme, I think, throughout the panels that we've heard about sort of educating for the future. And it's not something I really had thought about so much, but I'm realizing now that once a painting like this enters a public collection, you don't have control of the trajectory of its meaning. And that's actually, artists sort of think of that as like sometimes a negative, but I think it's positive because you never know how someone is going to interpret, use the work, how it's going to be meaningful for them. So it's been gratifying that this painting has had such a life in the institution, that it's seen by different kinds of, different kinds of audiences over the years. In the same way that, the Studio Museum in Harlem is going to reopen soon, and that sculpture that I made, Give Us a Poem, which has the words me, we, people said, oh yeah, my kids are grown up with that.
Wow.
Which is kind of very moving for me, that's a touchstone for, oh yeah, we walk by on 125th Street, see it from the window. So I would say, my kids would say, oh, I'll meet you at the me, we.
That is
Which
gorgeous.
is not something I thought about when I was making the work and realizing that it's in a public space, it's accessible even when the museum is closed because you could see it through the window, that it would be a touchstone for, not only for, people of my generation, but it would become a touchstone for other generations. And so I find it very moving to think about, as many people have said, you're making work not only for the present, but for the future.
Oh, yeah, that's totally fantastic. And I also love that, it's a work that draws us in because the surface is so interesting and textured, but at the same time, it's pushing you out to think, what is this sign historically? How to understand that? And it sort of maintains that tension. And that tension, I think, is why any number of contemporary artists, such as Sharon Hayes, Hank Willis Thomas.
Yes, piece upstairs. You can see it when you're walking up the stairs there. Hank Willis Thomas has done a whole series of works on paper that are plays on these words, I am a man.
So I think, in many ways, your critical resuscitation of 1988 licensed another set of artists, another generation of artists, to turn to the sign and ring their changes on it in exploring the limitations and possibilities of American democracy at a different moment. And of course, you got in on that act yourself with this work, 2001, your condition report, a series of prints. So I thought, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how this particular project came about and how you see it both indexing and cross-wiring, right? The material situation of the painting, the body politic, and horizons of freedom today.
Right. This was, as many of my works come about because I asked a stupid question to somebody who's smarter than I am, and they gave me an answer. So my stupid question was, I was visiting a friend at the Museum of Modern Art, a painting conservator, and he had on his desk this sort of image of a painting with all this writing all over it. And I asked, oh, what's that? And he said, oh, it's a condition report. It's when a painting is coming into the museum, you do a report to indicate all of the things that might need to be conserved, if the painting is going to enter the collection. And I thought, my cracking, fissuring, I am a man painting. So I gave him an image of the painting and had this conservator wrote these marks on it. So it is an actual record, this was done in 2000, Clinton was president, our first black president.
According to Toni Morrison.
According to Toni Morrison, but Toni Morrison's reading of that is very nuanced, it's very interesting, But what was interesting about it, doing it at that moment, was realizing, again, a check-in, What does it mean that this painting never is fixed? Somehow, that it's changing over time, that it has these cracks and fissures. Again, as I said before, it is about this kind of shift from one historical moment to the next, and sort of using the art object as this thing that's not just fixed in meaning because it was made at a certain time, but continues to change, continues to evolve. And so the condition report was a way of getting at that. But also just talking about, our changing ideas around the civil rights movement, the unfinished business of, that history of civil rights movement, of that history, our ideas about masculinity, who's included, who's excluded from these kinds of notions. It was a way of documenting that, basically.
Yeah, and I realized, too, it's also a kind of mapping of how to care for it. right? That like it's how you take care of this thing as it kind of continues to age. And I think that's one of those moments where the kind of cross-wiring between painting and body politic really works beautifully, right? Because I think that's so much what we're trying to do today, to understand how we need to care for and to continue this work. But I think one of the tensions that your work on the sign really brings to light is the way that demands for Black freedom historically have often been framed as explicitly masculinist and in many ways implicitly heteronormative. I am a man, right? And I think much the same can be said about the rhetoric around the Million Man March Day of Absence in 1995. And you engage those visual cultures in a series of silkscreens that I think give material shape to some of these contradictions. So in a work like Hands, we're given indices of this presumptively male Black mass, but we can't actually know whose bodies those hands are attached to, so there's something unknowable about that public. And then in a work like We're Black and Strong, your removal of text from the banner opens this space, right, for the projection of alternative demands, histories, desires, ways of being in the world. And so in revisiting these histories today, I think what visions of democracy can kind of come into focus when in looking back at these histories, we recenter, say, the Black women like Cornelia Crenshaw, who was absolutely essential to the success of that strike for the Memphis sanitation workers, and who is now honored in the IMM Plaza in Memphis with a plaque and an elementary school named after her, and also, a queer actor like Bayard Rustin, right, who was so important on the ground in making that march move forward.
Well, I think this was sort of very charged work for me because it was very close to the event. These paintings were made, a cycle of paintings dealing with images around the Million Man March that were culled from newspapers and magazines, and then they were made in '96. So they're very close to the historic event versus the I Am a Man, which was made 20 years after the signs were carried. So, but I thought, there were a couple of things. One, I was thinking about how Black people have gathered in these symbolic spaces on the Mall in Washington, D.C., to assert our visibility in a country that we've been in before it was even a country. And how this need to reassert a kind of visibility has a kind of absence in it. Because to assert visibility means one presumes there's a kind of absence that needs to be addressed. And that back and forth between legibility and absence, is certainly the figure of, sort of a lot of my work, text-based work, deals with sort of presence and absence and the disappearance or abstraction of text. But it's the first time I was really thinking about images. And so I was kind of looking in some ways for the absence in this gathering that's about visibility. And just by using the images from the newspaper, removing their captions, darkening them or lightening them, so the image on the banner disappears. The banner said, "We're Black and Strong." That image disappears. And so what does that banner say? What do we project onto it? What do we project onto the march, And also what you were talking about around who's included and who's excluded. Amiri Baraka said, "Why go to war and leave half the army behind?" In terms of the Million Man March, And so thinking about those kinds of politics, and of course, Bayard Rustin, as you were saying, in terms of like his visibility, has to be kind of resurrected from his, his centrality to the March on Washington has to be resurrected because he was sort of pushed to the background of it, even though he spoke, he had to be kind of sidelined a bit, So sort of thinking about that in the kind of using the images themselves, to find this kind of thing. And again, I think, a lot of things happen by accident. I was making images on a Xerox machine, remember Xerox machines? Blowing them up, and, a little newspaper image, blowing it up, it got darker and darker the more I blew it up, and I realized, like, oh, there's an absence in this image just by reproducing it in the way I'm doing. It brings out a certain kind of absence, and that became interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think, there's something really fascinating because that work on these questions of absence and visibility accords so well with the actually history of these movements as they're unfolding, right? In the way certain actors come in and out of visibility and historical reckoning. And I think it's only been in the last 20 years or so that folks like Cornelia Crenshaw and Hazel McGee, who were so important to the Memphis March, have really sort of got their due historically.
And I confess these are names that were new to me, so thank you for giving me that history.
Yeah, and also just, the Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was there in Memphis on the ground, and protesting broke out, and it was something that he and no one else could control, and so the National Guard troops came in. But the reason that protest started was that there was a rumor circulating that a black woman high school student had been murdered. Right? So that becomes this kind of spur. So I think when you reframe the kind of history of that march through these other lenses, sort of the importance of black women's engagement and the complexity of the gender politics of that moment really come to the fore. And especially too, if we think about, issues of queerness and someone like Bayard Rustin. I have had the opportunity to go to Memphis and to look at some of these original posters in the archive, and you really get a sense of their lived reality, right? So on the back of one, it's just like restroom downstairs, right? Because they just need to flip the poster over so people can know where to go to the bathroom, right? And then there's one that just has Ted plus Ralph on it. And I'm like, I don't know who that is. But how suggestive, right? That there's this kind of moment of homosociality that emerges, right, in this milieu. So with that said, I thought we might look to one of your more recent works, which turns us to the words of another Black queer luminary, James Baldwin, and his novel, Another Country. And I was wondering if you could speak about how you see the relationship between the kind of illicit, interracial, queer, beat milieu that Baldwin's describing then, and then the possibilities for differently, civically, imaging what America can and might be today.
Right. Well, noting it, sort of, we're Black and Strong, those works were made under Clinton. Another Country was made under Barack Obama. And thinking about, at that moment, I should have been in a celebratory mood. But I think artists are maybe, and I think it's been suggested in some of the panels too, we're kind of good wind sniffers. We're seeing what's going on, but we're also seeing what's coming. And so maybe the sort of backlash that was going to happen post-Obama was already in the air. You could sort of feel it coming, even at the very beginning of his presidency. So I was thinking about, Baldwin, all the things that you described, and his sort of utopian sense of what love can do, basically, that it transcends race, class, sexuality.
Yes.
It is the power that allows us to imagine a different kind of freedom, imagine another country. And so I was really interested in using those words, like the title as a synecdoche for his whole project in some ways. But I was also thinking about, this quote from Fred Moten, we can see the future we want, we can't see the future we want if we can't see the present we live in. And so thinking about sort of yes, artists are about imagining a different kind of future, as Sherrilyn has said very eloquently in many occasions, that artists are about imagining the future we want. Because it's hard to imagine the future in a way. It's easy to imagine what we don't want.
Right.
But it's very hard to imagine what we do want. And I feel like artists set themselves the task of imagining what we might want in the future, which is a hard task. You know?
Right. Well, and I love that it's a title that is moving back and forward in time, right? It takes us back to Baldwin, but it's always a beacon for us to think about imagining another country, and another country that is in many ways already present if we can bring it into reality.
Right. And also thinking about Baldwin as this figure that goes in and out of visibility too. Baldwin is everywhere now, you know. But when I started working with the text, and I've told this story at other venues, in the early 80s, I was in a art program, and we had all this sort of complicated theory we had to read for these discussions. And I said to my studio mate, sharing a little tiny studio, I said, oh, I've been reading James Baldwin as a kind of palate cleanser. And my studio mate said, James Baldwin, who's that? And I realized it's not the problem that she had never read James Baldwin, it's the problem is she'd never heard the name.
Yes.
But she'd heard of Foucault, she'd heard of, you know, like all of those folks. But I just thought, oh, so that's my project in some ways, is to bring that knowledge into the space of artwork. In the same way that, you know, Carrie James Marshall talks about bringing Black figuration to the space of the museum, you know, that you walk into the museum and you see Black figures. But that's not, I'm not a representative painter, you know, like that. So I guess my version of that is like, you walk into a museum and you see James Baldwin's text. You know, that's my version of that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you,
for
this conversation, and thank you all for listening.